Winter in Karelia is more than just a season. It's a force of nature capable of changing people's personalities, determining their destinies, and forging an inner core that can't be broken by anything. Here, snow covers the ground so deeply that it obscures even the contours of the hills. Trees, shrouded in frost, stand motionless, as if immersed in a century-long slumber. The frosts can be so intense that even a person's breath turns into a fragile mist, vanishing before it rises into the air. It was here, among the hills, pine forests and frozen lakes, that Simo was born. Häyhä, his village, Rautijärvi, was a small world where everyone knew everyone else. People lived simply. They grew potatoes, raised cows, cut down trees, and hunted deer and foxes. National borders and the political games of the world seemed distant, almost unreal. But in these conditions, the character that would later make Simo famous around the world was formed. From early childhood, he was drawn to the forest. For other children, the forest was a place to play. But for Simo, it was a space where he felt more at home than among people. He could wander for hours among the pines, watching the movements of birds, peering at tracks in the snow, listening to the wind play with the pine branches. He spoke little, but he saw a lot. His family lived through great hardship, but they lived harmoniously. His father taught him to shoot not out of ambition, it was a part of life. In these parts, hunting wasn't a pastime, but a means of survival. Every bird, hare, or fox they caught could become food or fur. Simo received his first rifle at around age 12. It was an old, slightly worn hunting rifle, handed down by his father with a slight smile. "Let's see what happens." Simo didn't answer. He simply took the weapon in his hands and felt its weight, its balance, the coldness of the metal. It became one of those pivotal moments in life, after which fate takes an unexpected turn and never returns. He trained non-stop, first at targets, then at moving objects. He learned to shoot in different weather conditions: blizzards, heavy snowfalls, twilight, freezing temperatures, windy conditions. Soon, he became the best marksman in the area. So good that local hunters, observing his accuracy, sometimes shook their heads. Such an eye is rare. "It's as if he sees with the wind," said one old man. All this happened long before the world heard the name Simo. He grew up without thinking about war. Life flowed peacefully. But fate had a test in store for him. Karelia is a region where man and nature exist in almost equal balance. Here, you can't conquer the elements. You can only learn to live alongside them. And Simo learned. He quickly developed unique skills, sensing frost by smell, guessing the distance to a target by a subtle glint, and discerning the strength of the wind by the sway of pine needles. It was an intuition that bordered on a sixth sense. He grew up strong and physically resilient. Skis were his constant companion. He could cover dozens of kilometers a day without feeling tired. The forest became part of his thinking, his home, his tools, his shelter. When the time came for mandatory military training, Simo joined the local Finnish army unit. He wasn't looking to make a career for himself. He was simply doing his duty as a citizen. However, his marksmanship was immediately noticed. His shooting accuracy was outstanding. His patience was phenomenal. His endurance was absolute. At the shooting range, he demonstrated results that even experienced soldiers could not achieve. "The guy from the forest," the instructors said. "He is the forest." It sounded like praise, but at the same time like a prediction. During training, he first encountered the Finnish M28-30 rifle, a modification of the Russian Mosin Nagant Troika. He immediately realized that this weapon was perfect for him: simple, reliable, without unnecessary details, and capable of withstanding the cold. It was with this rifle that he would later write his legend. After his service, he returned home. He lived the same life as before, working on the farm, hunting, helping his family. The years passed. War seemed a distant threat. But in the autumn of 1939, Finland felt the approach of a gathering storm. Political tensions between the Soviet Union and Finland grew. The Soviet leadership demanded territory, citing Leningrad's security as a reason. Finland refused. Anxiety hung in the air, though the Finns believed to the very end that war could be avoided. But conflicts between great powers rarely depend on the will of smaller countries. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet troops crossed the border. Simo's world collapsed in an instant. The call-up came quickly. He didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed his rifle and headed to his unit. The Kola River. Kolja would later become a symbol of Finnish resistance. However, in the early days, it was simply forest, frozen ground, and a narrow defensive line. The Finnish army was small. Its soldiers were poorly equipped, often lacking warm clothing, ammunition, and even food. But they had 3 advantages. 1. Knowledge of the area. 2. Ability to fight in extremely low temperatures. 3. Incredible determination to resist. Simo was assigned to a unit under the command of Lieutenant Simo Häyhä, a man who will later say, "When Häyhä shot, we knew the line was holding." But that will come later. At the beginning of December 1939, no one knew who Simo was, not even himself. At first, he marched like a regular infantryman. He built shelters, dug trenches, and hauled firewood for warmth. The Finnish soldiers slept on spruce branches, covered with thin blankets. The frosts were so severe that the water in their mess tins froze within minutes. That's when his abilities were noticed. On one section of the front, a Soviet machine gun wiped out half a Finnish platoon. The commander demanded the gunner be eliminated. Volunteers were few. Simo took a step forward. He took up a position in a snowy hollow, dug so deep that even his white camouflage was barely distinguishable from the shelter. He spent almost 2 hours there, motionless, patient. Then a shot rang out. One, the only one. The machine gun fell silent. When he returned, the commander asked in surprise, "How did you see him?" Simo just shrugged. He was breathing too loudly. This short remark made a strong impression. It was calm, devoid of pathos, and yet it revealed Simo's keen sense of space. After this incident, he was assigned as a sniper. He received an M28-30 rifle and ammunition, as well as a white jumpsuit, which was mandatory in the snow. From then on, his lone war began. Every morning he would go into the forest, take up an observation point, pack the snow around himself, lie down, and begin his observation. Sometimes he would wait for hours, sometimes all day. But when a target appeared, he acted instantly. Sniper warfare is a war of patience, psychology, and analysis. And Simo mastered these qualities to perfection. He was always on the lookout for officers, machine gunners, radio operators, those whose deaths weakened the unit. He rarely shot at ordinary soldiers unless it threatened his position or was part of the mission. His tally grew with each passing day. By the end of the first week, he had hit around 36 targets. By mid-December, about 100. Rumors spread quickly. Sleds, drags, people's footsteps, everything left traces. The forest in winter is an open book for those who know how to read it. And Simo knew how. He intuitively chose positions from which he could see as far as possible. He always found a spot where the wind wouldn't blow snow toward his target that could give him away. He looked for shadows or depressions. His eyes were so trained that he noticed not just movement, but changes in the structure of the forest, the subtle curvature of a branch, the slightest tint of cotton fabric on the snow. Officers at the front often said, When Häyhä is in position, we can work more calmly. And it was true. His presence alone was a morale booster. But the opposite also happened. Fear spread among Soviet soldiers. They didn't know his name, but they knew his shot. Later, a nickname would appear, White Death. But for now, they simply called him that shooter. What frightened them about him was that he was impossible to find. Artillery shelled the suspected areas, but each time it turned out he was long gone. It was impossible to leave him behind. It was as if he were pursuing the advancing troops. In mid-December, near the village of Uyutyu, an episode occurred that Simo would remember for the rest of his life as an ordinary day. But for the Red Army, it became a day of losses and chaos. The Soviet column moved along a narrow path. It was well-trodden. Dozens of people had walked along it before. It was impossible to leave the path. Deep snowdrift surrounded it. As the first soldier entered the clearing, a shot rang out. He fell instantly. The soldiers froze. It was their first mistake, stopping under a sniper's fire. Second shot, second soldier. Third. Panic began to grow. People ducked, tried to take cover behind their comrades, behind backpacks, to no avail. They were in the open, and the shooter left them no chance. The officer shouted, "Get down! Find the sniper!" But his voice was drowned out by fear. Another shot. The officer falls. The column is demoralized. They don't understand where the enemy is shooting from. They don't hear the direction. They don't see the flash. And Simo rearranges the rifle and continues his methodical work. By the evening, this column no longer existed as an organized unit. This episode was just the beginning. The position near the Kola River became one of the most symbolic sites of the Winter War. Here, over a stretch of approximately 40 kilometers, the Finns held off the superior forces of the Red Army for more than 2 months. This would not have been possible without people like Simo. He wasn't alone. Finland had many excellent snipers, but he was the best. His contribution couldn't be measured by the number of targets he hit. He changed the dynamics of battles. The company commander said, "If Häyhä is in position, you can expect half the attack to be disrupted." This is not an exaggeration. There were days when he worked for 20 hours. There were days when he hit 20-25 targets. One time, 25 in one day. This day went down in history. At that moment, he became a legend, although he didn't think so himself. When it became clear that a single man was causing disproportionately large losses, the Soviet command made a decision: send experienced snipers to eliminate him. This is how the sniper duels began. One of them was later described by surviving Finns. A Soviet sniper took up position at the edge of the forest. He was experienced and trained. He knew the Finnish marksman was working in that square. He waited. After a few hours, he noticed a slight movement, something barely noticeable. He took aim, but he didn't have time to shoot. Simo's bullet entered his forehead. When the Finns examined the body, they found a disguise designed for a professional. Someone said, "This one was dangerous. It's good that Simo saw him earlier." There were many such episodes. By mid-January 1940, the Winter War had reached its most dramatic phase. Frosts that had previously seemed severe now became deadly. Temperatures regularly dropped below 35 degrees C, and sometimes even below 40 degrees C. In such conditions, metal contracted, wood cracked, and the human body lost feeling after just a few minutes of inactivity. Finnish soldiers said this weather protected them rather than killed them. The enemy, coming from far away and poorly prepared, suffered far more. Tanks wouldn't start. Machine guns froze. Red Army soldiers, dressed in heavy greatcoats and padded jackets, couldn't move quickly through the deep snow. For a sniper, such conditions were both a challenge and a gift. The frost made the air clearer, the sound more crisp, and the lines of sight more contrasting. But at the same time, The slightest mistake could lead to disaster. Breath turned into vapor, giving away one's position. Fingers could freeze if a glove was removed for too long, and the metal bolt of a rifle could stick to one's skin. Simo had been accustomed to the cold since childhood. He knew how to move, how to breathe, how to retain heat. He wore thin wool gloves, over which he wore thicker fur mittens, removing them only when he fired. Every day, he left for his positions long before dawn. The forest was especially quiet at this hour, as if the world had momentarily stopped. He could hear a single snowflake falling, the crunch of a deer's paw on the ice. The further the war progressed, the more often his presence became the key factor in maintaining the position. The front line fluctuated, but held. And that was his merit. This battle became a turning point, not only for the Finns, but also for Simo himself. It was the day he demonstrated the incredible synergy between a hunter's experience, a sniper's skills, and a soldier's composure. The Soviet army planned to break through the area near the village of Ladanjärvi, a small settlement surrounded by hills on all sides. Essentially, it offered a natural bowl-shaped area where troops could advance with some protection from the wind. This is why the Red Army Command decided to use it to concentrate its forces. Early in the morning, scouts reported that the roar of engines could be heard ahead. T-26 tanks were moving towards the front lines. Finnish troops received orders to hold their position at any cost. Simo moved forward, to a height from which he could see the entire valley. He chose a spot on the slope, where a lone, crooked pine tree grew, bent by the wind. The tree concealed his silhouette and provided natural shade. He dug a bed in the snow, compacted the surface in front of him, laid down his rifle, and began observation. First came the tanks. Their engines roared. Their tracks tore through the snow, leaving deep furrows. Behind the tanks came the infantry, in close formation. For a sniper, it was a perfect picture. But Simo was in no hurry. He never fired at just any target. He chose only those whose death would disrupt the course of the battle. He noticed the officer first, by the way he moved, by the raised hand, by the manner of giving commands. The distance is about 300 meters. The wind is light from the left side. Simo took a breath. Shot. The officer fell. The column slowed for a moment. The soldiers began to look around, unsure where the bullet had come from. A second target appeared, a radio operator who was trying to set up the station. Shot. The radio operator fell. The infantry completely lost control. The tanks continued to advance, but without correction, they became vulnerable. The Finnish sappers seized the opportunity. One of them crawled along a low spot where the snow was particularly deep and placed a high explosive charge under the front tank. A few seconds later, a deafening explosion was heard. The tank rose up on its tracks, then fell onto its side. The column stopped. Simo continued to work. His rifle rarely fired, but each shot was deadly. Within minutes, the attack was completely thwarted. The commander of the Finnish unit later said, "If Simo hadn't removed the officers in the first minutes, we would have retreated today." But he held the line. After the fight, someone asked him, "How did you decide who to shoot first?" Simo answered briefly, "Those who speak, rule. Those who rule are the most dangerous." This was the essence of his strategy. The Winter War was a war of forests and skis. Finnish soldiers could move through the snow so quickly that Soviet units simply couldn't react. Ski detachments, nicknamed White Devils by the enemy, carried out night raids, destroyed supply columns, and disrupted communications. Simo participated in several such operations. He wasn't a stormtrooper. His role was different. He provided surveillance and cover. In January, one of the detachments was tasked with intercepting a small Red Army supply column that was moving at night along a clearing between two forests. The column consisted of sleds, several trucks, and men carrying boxes of ammunition. The operation was important. The Finns were catastrophically short of ammunition, and any disruption to the enemy's supply line would increase their chances of survival. Simo took up position 2 hours before the operation began. He chose a slight depression at the foot of the hill, from where he could see the clearing. He lay down in the snow, carefully camouflaging himself with spruce branches. The night was dark. Snow fell sparsely, in large flakes. The frost grew stronger. He waited. When the column appeared, he didn't fire right away. He watched, sizing up the group's structure. 1, 2, 3 loaders. Then came the guards. 2 walked ahead, 1 behind. One's rifle hung low, almost brushing the sled. The other's was at the ready. He chose the one who goes ahead. Shot. The soldier falls. The snow dimly reflects the flash. The column stops. "Sniper! Get down!" comes the shout. Panic is growing. The Finnish detachment seizes this opportunity. A quick dash on skis, an attack, and grenade throwing. Within minutes, the column is destroyed. Simo remains in position until the very end of the operation, until the last Finn retreats into the forest. This episode shows how important the ability to operate in conditions of deep darkness and zero visibility was in the Winter War. The battle near Halo was one of the most difficult for the Finns. It was a major sector of the Red Army's offensive, involving several battalions simultaneously. The Soviet command sought to break through the defenses using its numerical superiority. The day was bright, but cold. The sun reflected off the snowy surface, blinding those looking out onto the open spaces. Simo arrived at his position early, 2 hours before the planned offensive. He sat in the snow, feeling the frost bite into his skin, his body slowly cooling. But he felt right at home in these conditions. When the Soviet infantry began to advance, he already had his rifle at the ready. The first targets appeared about 400 meters away, far away, but within his confident range. He fired shot after shot, hitting the most dangerous soldiers, the machine gunners. He knew that if the machine gun reached a favorable position, the Finns would lose dozens of men. "Machine gunner on the left!" one of the Finns shouted, but before anyone could prepare, a shot would ring out and the target would fall. This happened 5 times. The snow was strewn with bodies. But the Soviet army continued to advance. They began firing at the slopes where the Finnish sniper might be. Bullets flew into the snow near Simo, raising clouds of ice. But he didn't move. Only once did a soldier from his unit crawl up to him and quietly ask, "Are you alive?" Simo just nodded. "Go on," said the soldier. "We can't hold out without you." And he continued. When the battle ended, the Finns repelled the offensive. The Soviet troops lost about 100 men in this sector alone. Several officers approached the battle site and saw traces of a single sniper position, compact, neat, carefully camouflaged. "There was a master working here," said one of the officers. Another added, "No, Häyhä worked here." The more Simo's effectiveness grew, the more fear grew among the Red Army soldiers. They said, "The White Death is here. If one fell, it means he's nearby. Don't move. Don't raise your head. Don't breathe loudly." This fear paralyzed the fighting ability of entire units. The psychology of war is a subtle thing. Sometimes one person can change the dynamics of a situation for miles around. One of the captured soldiers later said, "We weren't afraid of the cold. Snow kills slowly. We were afraid of the gunshot. It kills instantly." Realizing that a single shooter was causing unacceptable losses, the Soviet command stepped up its measures. The best snipers, specially trained, were sent to the front. They were shown photographs of possible positions and told about Finnish tactics and camouflage. But they didn't know one thing. Simo was no ordinary sniper. He thought differently. One day, a Soviet sniper set up an ambush opposite a suspected Finnish position He waited all day. He was sure he spotted a shadow, a hint of movement. At one point, he was sure he'd found Häyhä. He took aim, but Simo was faster. His bullet hit the target perfectly. Finnish soldiers found the body of a Soviet sniper. He was carrying an expensive rifle with sophisticated optics. "He was good," said one Finnish commander. Simo replied, "Good people make fewer mistakes, but they do make them." It was a rare, long sentence for him. One of the most famous episodes occurred at the end of January. On that day, Simo hit a record number of targets. The snow was deep. The temperature reached 40°. Even breathing seemed painful. The Finns received word that a large group of Soviet soldiers was preparing to attack. Simo took up position early and began observation. One after another, he struck down officers and key soldiers, sometimes 2 in a minute. By midday, it became clear the offensive would not take place. It had been thwarted by literally one man. When the Finnish soldiers returned to their position in the evening, they saw that Simo was still lying in the snow, almost completely covered in frost. "Are you alive?" asked one. "Yes," he answered calmly. "There's still work to do." To understand Simo's combat style, you need to imagine his typical day at the front. He wasn't known for his outward drama. The contrary, his everyday life was characterized by an almost frightening simplicity. But it was precisely this simplicity that made him a formidable weapon. The day began long before the sun appeared above the pines. Night in Karelia in winter is almost uninterrupted darkness, with only the dim gray light of midday hinting at daylight. Finnish soldiers awoke in the cold, struggling to stretch their numb limbs. Simo was the first to rise. He immediately checked the rifle. It was his primary tool. He removed the bolt, inspected the barrel, cleared it of frost, and checked the cartridges. He did this quickly but carefully. The rifle's metal parts easily became coated with frost, and any malfunction could cost him his life. Then he'd eat a little, usually a piece of rye bread, sometimes dried meat if he had any. Food wasn't about taste, it was about fuel. He moved toward his position slowly, unhurriedly, as if simply strolling through the pre-dawn forest. But this was part of the job. He studied the snow, the tracks, the structure of the drifts, the direction of the wind. When he found the right spot, he began digging a hole. Sometimes it took 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. He did it silently, slowly, precisely. Once the hole was ready, he carefully packed the snow in front of him to avoid a splash when he fired. And so, he lay down on his stomach, burrowed into the snow, became part of the landscape. From that moment on, he could remain motionless for hours. Sometimes, he remained motionless for so long that the surrounding snow covered him with a thin layer of frost. This is how each of his combat days began. The most important part of a sniper's work isn't the shot, it's the anticipation. A sniper isn't a hunter, he's an observer, waiting for the moment when one shot can change the situation on the front. Simo often said, "Observation is 90% of the job. The shot is just the finishing touch." During the Winter War, the forest always spoke, but quietly. The slightest rustle could be a hare's tracks. The whistle of the wind could be a sign of an approaching blizzard. But sometimes, these same sounds could betray a soldier's movements. Simo knew how to distinguish one from the other. He noticed the rhythm of footsteps, even if they were barely audible. He saw the movement of branches out of sync with the wind. He discerned shapes, the silhouette of a helmet among the branches, the line of a rifle jutting out of a trench, the light reflected off the sight glass. One day, while observing, he noticed a barely visible point of light between 2 pine trees. The light was faint, but in the still winter forest, it seemed alien. He realized it was a glare from the optics, a Soviet sniper. He waited until the enemy rose a little higher and fired instantly. Soldiers later found the body. The sniper had an excellent rifle, expensive optics, and high-quality camouflage. But none of it helped, Simo later said briefly. He forgot to close the lens. In the sun, the lens is a lamp. This wasn't bragging. It was cold analysis. For Simo, every mistake, even the smallest, was fatal. Sniper duels were among the most intense episodes of the war. These weren't firefights in the traditional sense. They were battles of patience, willpower, and attentiveness. Finnish soldiers remembered one of these duels for years. It happened in early February. The forest was especially quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Finnish intelligence reported that a Soviet sniper had been spotted in the area where Simo was working. He was apparently hunting Finnish officers. Simo took up his position almost at dawn. He knew the enemy would be looking for him. He knew it was a trap. But he came anyway. Hours passed. Nothing happened. It was only at midday that he saw a barely noticeable, almost illusory movement, as if a piece of snow on the distant slope had trembled slightly. He didn't shoot. An hour passed. 2. 3. He sensed the enemy, but he couldn't see him. At some point, he realized the Soviet sniper was deliberately creating false movements. He was a professional. He was trying to trick the Finn into giving himself away. And then Simo did what he always did. He waited. Day was giving way to dusk. The frost grew stronger. Breathing became almost painful. At some point, he noticed a real trace, an instantaneous micro-movement when a person changes position just a little. He took aim. Shot. The silence was broken by a short, almost inhuman scream. Finnish soldiers later found the body. When one of them said, "He was good," Simo replied, "He was very good. But he moved too early." It was their only face-to-face duel, if that word can even be used. War breaks people. But there were also those whom war only revealed. Simo never took pleasure in shooting. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't bloodthirsty. His work was hard, exhausting, and necessary. When someone asked him how he dealt with psychological pressure, he once replied, "When you know that you are defending your homeland, you don't think about what's scary." This phrase sounded simple, but it explained a lot. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a soldier who did his job better than anyone else. His Finnish comrades often remarked that outside of combat, he was a very gentle man, quiet, disciplined, and meticulous. He always helped around the house. He fetched firewood, cleaned tools, and repaired skis. But when he picked up a rifle, he changed. He became focused, extremely calm, almost dispassionate. One of the commanders said, "He has the look of a man who hears what others don't. He sees what we don't notice. He lives in two worlds among people and within the forest." And it was indeed so. The forest was part of his consciousness. One of the most dramatic battles was the defense of Kelajärvi Hill, a small but strategically important elevation. It allowed control of a section of the road along which the Red Army could advance its tanks. The Finns were ordered to hold the hill at all costs. Simo arrived there the day before the battle. He studied the terrain and found several advantageous positions. One was on the eastern slope, among the rocks. Another was near a clump of young pine trees, where he could find cover behind the natural curves of the earth. The third was in a small pit, which he began to widen by hand. He prepared several points to change positions faster than his opponent. The battle began suddenly. First, an artillery salvo. The ground shook. Pine trees cracked. Snow flew up in columns. The Finns huddled close to the ground, trying to wait it out. As soon as the shelling stopped, the infantry attack began. The Soviet soldiers marched in a tight formation, hoping to take the hill through sheer numbers. Simo started working. He chose his first targets, the officers. Shot. The officer fell. A second later, the second. The infantry began to slow. Men instinctively sought cover, but there was little shelter. The hill was an open space. Finnish machine guns opened fire. Sappers laid mines. The battle raged. Simo spotted a machine gunner trying to set up a heavy machine gun. If he had succeeded, the Finns would have lost dozens of men. Simo moved to another position just a few meters. The movement took a minute, but was imperceptible. Shot. The machine gunner fell. Another fighter picks up the machine gun. A shot. He falls. The third one tries to load the tape. Shot. 5 minutes later, the attempt to install the machine gun failed completely. The Finnish commander later said, "If the machine gun had started working, it would have been the end for us. But Häyhä bought us time." After 2 hours, the attack was repelled. When the battle ended, the Finns counted more than 150 bodies of Soviet soldiers at the foot of the hill, and not a single machine gun was operational. One of the most dangerous episodes was the Red Army's attempt to cross a frozen river at night. The ice was thick, but covered with a thick layer of snow, and crossing the river would allow for a quick flanking maneuver. The Finns knew that if the river fell, the defense would collapse. At night, around 3 o'clock, Simo heard the crunch of ice. He raised his head. Shadows were barely visible in the darkness on the opposite bank. He realized that the crossing was beginning. He took a position closer to the shore to get a better view. And with the first shot, he took out the head of the column, the soldier who was walking in front. The crossing slowed. People began to look back. What was that? A sniper? In the dark? Impossible. The next shot was the radio operator. The third was the officer. Panic set in. Soldiers fell onto the ice. Some tried to turn back. The ice cracked. Finnish machine guns opened fire. Sappers lit torches they had prepared earlier, illuminating the crossing. It was chaos. Simo's shots that disrupted the crossing. Within half an hour, the river was strewn with bodies. Later, one Finn said, "All we saw was a flash and the target falling. In the darkness, his shot sounded like the breath of death." In late February, the Red Army attempted to break through the forest road leading to the Finnish fortified area. This was a serious blow that could have changed the course of the war. The Finns held on with all their might. Simo worked non-stop for 14 hours that day, changing positions more than 20 times. He was freezing, but he kept shooting. At some point, one of the soldiers crawled up to him and said, "You haven't eaten for 20 hours. Simo replied, "I'll eat after we hold the road." He fired, then the second one, then the third. On this day, he hit more than 24 targets, the same number as on his famous record day in January. But more importantly, he disrupted the offensive. A few days before the fateful March 6th, a fight took place that many considered the most dangerous in his career. A Soviet sniper had set up shop on the far slope. He was good. So good that the Finns began losing men 3 that morning. Simo volunteered himself. He took up a position in a deep hole under the roots of a pine tree. He waited. The enemy was perfectly hidden. 3 hours passed, then 2 more. Snow began to fall in large flakes. Visibility deteriorated, and suddenly, a barely noticeable shadow. Simo fired a shot. Silence. And then, the sound of a falling body. Finnish soldiers later found the enemy. He truly was a master. The camouflage was perfect. The position was well thought out. The weapons were the best. The commander said, "He was almost like you." Simo replied, "Almost." March 6, 1940, began like a typical day at the front. Snow fell gently, and there was almost no wind, a rarity for early spring in Karelia. The air was still, clear, and cold. It was perfect weather for sniper work. The lack of wind ensured a straight bullet trajectory, and the soft light of the dispersing clouds reduced the risk of glare. Simo woke up before everyone else. He drank water that hadn't yet turned to ice and ate a piece of bread. These days, he barely felt hungry. His body operated automatically, as did his mind. He checked the rifle, running his palm over the wood of the stock. The movement was almost gentle, like a master touching an instrument before a performance. He knew that every detail mattered. One of the soldiers, a young man with cheeks reddened from the cold, came up and asked, "Going to the forest again today?" Simo nodded. "You won't get tired?" asked the soldier. Pause. "I'll get tired later," Simo answered shortly. That's what he was, a man of action. The spot where he'd taken up position on March 6th was familiar to him. He'd worked here before. It was a shallow slope, leading into a ravine that could be seen for 500, 600 meters ahead. Dense pine trees hugged the slope on both sides. The snow lay evenly, almost untouched. He dug a place to lie down. He packed the snow in front of him. He lay down. The silence was perfect. He spotted movement 5 minutes later. A group of Soviet soldiers was crossing the clearing. They were moving confidently, probably a reconnaissance force. He singled out an officer and fired. The officer fell instantly. The rest threw themselves into the snow. This moment, the momentary confusion when the soldiers still didn't know what to do, was the best time to fire a second shot. He did it. There was no miss. The next moment was long. He waited. He watched. The forest was silent. The wind did not blow. It is precisely this calm that will play a decisive role. The Red Army had good snipers. Many of them had been trained in marksmanship schools. Some were specifically sent to the positions where the rumored Finnish marksmen most often operated. That day, a Soviet sniper took up a position opposite, about 150 meters away. It was dangerously close, almost a personal duel. He chose a good spot, a small ledge on the slope, where the snow formed a natural rampart. He was experienced. He did everything right. But fate had its own plan. Snow reflects light so much that even the slightest movement can cause a flash. Simo knew this, so he always tried to position his rifle so the metal wouldn't reflect the sun's rays. But that morning, the sun peeked out from behind a dark cloud for a split second. The forest was illuminated by a faint light. This light fell on the tiny metal protrusion of the rifle, and a glare appeared. Small, barely noticeable. But an experienced Soviet shooter noticed him. He acted instantly. Shot. The bullet hit Simo in the lower part of his face. It was a hollow point cartridge, expanding on impact. The explosion was horrific. His cheek was torn apart. His jaw was shattered. Blood stained the snow. The world faded. The sound receded. All that remained was the taste of blood and the dull thump of my own heart. Finnish soldiers saw him fall. 2 of them rushed toward him, almost crawling, fearing a second shot. They found him lying on his side, his face covered in blood. One of them whispered, "Oh my God. Simo, can you hear me?" Simo couldn't speak. He tried to raise his hand, but his fingers were shaking. The second soldier shouted, "A stretcher! Quickly!" They dragged him through the snow, leaving a trail of blood. Every meter was hard. Sim was partially conscious. He saw fragments. He heard loud voices, as if through a thick wall. "Don't let him lose heat. Cover him with blankets. Where's the doctor?" Someone leaned towards him and said quietly, "Hold on. Just hold on." He was taken to the hospital late in the evening. Doctors were shocked by the extent of the damage. The surgeon would later say, he shouldn't have survived. But he did. The operation lasted several hours. They pieced his face back together like a mosaic. They stopped the bleeding. They replaced the broken fragments with bone from his femur. Simo was unconscious for 8 days, and it was on the 8th day, when he opened his eyes, that the nurse said, "The war is over." The Winter War ended on March 13, 1940. Finland lost territory, but retained its independence. Simo wasn't at the front in the final days of the war. He was in a hospital where the walls were as white as snow, but smelled not of the forest, but of antiseptics. He heard the news without an emotional reaction. He wasn't one to express his feelings in words. But deep down, he knew his role was over. Finland survived, and he did everything he could. The recovery was long. His face was disfigured. He couldn't speak for a while. But he learned to speak again, to eat, to even smile. When journalists tried to interview him, he said, "I did what I had to. There's nothing more to discuss." He didn't strive for fame. He didn't write books. He didn't participate in politics. He returned to what he loved: hunting, the forest, the silence. The animals didn't know him as the White Death. They knew him as a man who walked quietly and respected nature. He lived to be 96 years old. After the war, Simo's name became legendary. He hit over 500 targets, more than any other sniper in history, in such a short time. But it wasn't about the numbers. It was about how he worked, how he was part of the forest, how he fought not for glory, but for home. Historians say he was the perfect sniper, not because of his records, but because of his lack of ego. The soldiers say he saved thousands of lives with his patience. The Finns say he was the face of our winter, cold, quiet, steadfast. Russian veterans said the only thing worse than the cold was him. There's a spot in Karelia where his position once stood. The pine trees there still grow twisted by the wind. Snow falls thickly. The Kola River still flows quietly beneath the ice. Sometimes local hunters say that early on a winter morning you can see the outline of a man in white on the slope. Vague, a little blurry, as if some of the snow had risen and then settled down again. It's just a trick of the light, or fog, or a mirage. But legends don't live in the forest. Legends live in those who remember. A name heard with both delight and horror. A name that survived the war. A name that became a symbol of the resilience of a small country against a vast empire. Simo Häyhä, White Death.